Hello and welcome to Elevate 2021. My name is Francisco Martinez and I'm going to be the presenter for this session. On this session, I'll be showing you how to use JMeter to perform load testing on PowerServer web APIs. Now let's review the session agenda. We're going to begin by defining our testing goals. We're then going to go and set up the environment. And in this session, we'll be simulating two cases. One will be the basic case in which we're gonna only simulate some reading operations from a single user. And then we're gonna also simulate an advanced case in which we're gonna simulate both the CRUD operations, which include querying, creating, modifying, and deleting some data. We're gonna simulate this case in both a single user scenario and also simultaneous user scenario. After that, we're gonna do a little bit of cleanup because we're gonna need to do some adjustments to the system, and that would be it for this session. Here you can see a little bit of information about me and a little bit about the company I work for. In this session, we'll be using the example sales app that is included with Power Builder installations. Make sure that you can actually run it and that it's available for you to use. Let's define our testing goals for this session. We'll be simulating a data window CRUD operation using the sales demo application in the customers window, and we're also going to simulate some embedded SQL queries in the same application. For the first case, we're going to simulate both single user use case and multiple user use case. And for the load we're going to be simulating one user performing 200 operations, and we're also going to be simulating 200 users performing several operations at the same time. And with that out of the way, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is download JMeter. I'm gonna go to the URL I'm gonna put on the video, or if you only go to Google and search for JMeter, the first search results should be the JMeter page. So in here, we're gonna go to download releases. I'm gonna select the zip file right here in the binary section. I'm gonna wait for it to download, and once it's downloaded, you need to extract it and open the folder. In case you're wondering what JMeter is an application, open source application developed by Apache that is intended to be used as a load testing application for different types of services. In this case, we're going to be using it for HTTP load testing, and since it's developed in Java, we can use it in pretty much any platform that supports Java. So in this case, I already opened the folder in which I downloaded JMeter. I'm gonna go to the bin folder, and then I'm gonna open the jmeter.bat, which is a Windows batch file. As you can see right here, there's many types of extensions to launch JMeter because JMeter is multi-platform, so there's scripts for most platforms available. In this case, I'm gonna go and open JMeter. I'm gonna wait for it to open. And this is it. This is the main application. To give a quick introduction on what the UI looks like. So basically, this is the main window. Up here on the toolbar, there's a couple of buttons we're going to be using quite a lot. For example, this run start button is what we're going to use to run the tests once we have actually built them. This button right here is used to create new nodes in the node tree right here. I'm going to explain it in a moment. And in order to save the test plans we create, we go to the file menu. Inside the search menu, there's the search function, and we're going to be using these functions quite a bit. And that's pretty much the most important things in here. Like I mentioned, I'm going to explain about the test plan in a bit more depth later. So next, we're going to go and set up the environment. The reason we need to do this is because there's a couple of things that have to be done in order for us to use JMeter to perform load testing. One of them is setting the project that we use, the PowerServer project, to make sure that it has the correct address and that it's not using localhost. And also we're gonna need to set up the system proxy in order for the requests that come from the application to go through JMeter and in order for it to be able to capture them. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be using the sales demo application that is included with the Power Builder installations. So first thing I'm going to do is go to the start menu. I'm going to search for sales. And this search result that comes up first to me is the example sales app. This is a Power Builder project that contains the application that we're going to be using for this demonstration. So first thing that I'm going to go and do is open the PowerServer project. In case you probably won't have this window open, I'm going to open it. This PowerServer project is inside the sales demo target, inside the sales demo library as well. So right here, I'm going to go to the Web APIs tab, and you need to make sure that this address right here is not using localhost. If you use localhost, JMeter won't be able to capture any packets because JMeter cannot listen on localhost. So right now I'm using this address because this is my network address. So you will need to make sure that this address is appropriate for your system. You will also need to make sure that this demo runs before you start doing this demo with me. So first thing we're gonna do is go and run this project. The first thing I'm gonna do is open the web APIs locally, and once it opens and it finishes building the project and building the dependencies, I'm gonna click run. This will launch a console window that will show us the output of our application, our web APIs that have been started. So once we see this message, it means that the web APIs are now running. I'm gonna go back to the PowerServer project. I'm gonna click here on build and deploy. And once you see this message, it means that the application deployed successfully. Now I can go and click this button that says Run PowerServer Project. I'm going to click it and it will launch the application. If you see this window, it means everything's okay. So now that we are sure that the application runs, I'm going to close it down. I'm going to go back to the to Snap Develop, and I'm going to open the applications file right here on the Solution Explorer. You might not have this window open, so if all you see is this, you go to the server APIs and then applications, and here where it says run mode, you're going to change it from 0 to 1. This is a very sensitive setting that you need to make sure you only enable for this test, for this session, because what this does when it's on 0 is that it encrypts a part of the session ID that we're going to be using for this testing. So it needs to be encrypted for the rest of the time, because if not, you'll open up your application for attacks. So you need to make sure that if you're not doing some testing, this needs to be on 0. Because we're going to be using the session ID and we need it to be unencrypted, we're going to set this to 1. I'm going to save this file. I'm going to close the web APIs that we're running already. I'm going to run them again. And once the console window shows up again, I'm going to go to the sales demo application one more time. I'm going to run it again. And now that you set the run mode to 1, you should see this window pop up before the application runs. This means that we are now on test mode, that your application is vulnerable, but it also means that we'll be able to perform some testing and using that session ID for our tests. I'm going to click OK, and the application will run. Once that's done, I'm going to go to JMeter, and we're going to create a template. We're going to set it to recording. So basically what we're going to do here is create a recording template through which we're going to record the operations we do through the sales demo, so that a test plan can be created from those requests by our application use. So once I've set this to recording, I'm going to create. We can leave this as default. Create. And this is the test plan it created for us. Some things I might need to explain right here. Test plan is basically our test. So it basically defines the set of requests and settings that will be used to perform the load testing. This Each one of these is a config set. It allows us to put configuration in here that will be applied to the rest of the test because it's on the test plan itself. So, for example, this setting allows us to define variables that we can then go and use inside the other parts of the test. The HTTP request defaults settings sampler allows us to set some parameters about the HTTP requests that we want the rest of the test to share. For example, we can define here the test so that in any other, for example, we can have many HTTP requests right here. And if we leave this path empty, it will go into the HTTP request defaults and it will take whatever path is in here. So this way we can logically group different samplers. These are samplers, by the way. Each one of these that will perform as a specific action is a sampler. This is how JMeter calls them. So this settings set defines the defaults for all the HTTP requests that are on the same level or below it. So that means it will, if we had a sampler right here, it will, oh well, we cannot have samples right here. There needs to be a thread. I'm going to explain what threads are in a bit. But first, I'm going to go and finish explaining the HTTP request defaults. We can define basically all default settings we want for the HTTP requests. Next, the HTTP cookie manager it's recommended that you have at least one HTTP cookie manager when you're doing web testing, unless you're absolutely sure that your application makes no use of cookies. Otherwise, you should always have one. You can leave it at blank, but this needs to be present for the tests to use cookies and manage cookies and so on. So next, thread groups are basically what groups the computational threads that are going to be running our tests. It basically stands for a group of users that will be running whatever tests we put in here. Inside the thread group, you can configure basically how many threads you want to be run. A thread stands for one user basically. So if you had 10 threads right here in this group, whatever requests are grouped inside this group will be run by 10 threads. So that would be 10 users performing this request at the same time. We can specify also the ramp-up period. That means how much time needs to pass before the amount of threads you specified here is started. So for example, if we have 1 second right here, it means that our 10 threads will all be started after 1 second. So if we set it to 10, it means that the first second, one thread will be started, the second, another thread will be started, third second, another thread, and so on until after 10 seconds, all 10 threads have started. Loop count means basically what it says. It means that any and all requests that are grouped inside this thread will be executed 10 times, which means that one thread will go to the last request, and then if this loop count is greater than 1 and the thread is at the last request, it will start from the beginning again. So that's what these three settings mean. I'm gonna delete this request for now. When we created the recording template, it added for us a controller right here that is disabled. That means we need to enable it in order to be able to record the test. Right here is a port we need to set. That will be the port in which JMeter will be listening for requests. We need to set this to something that you need to remember. I'm going to set it to 48 for the time being. We're going to change our target controller. This is where JMeter will put the request it captures. So I want to put it inside here, inside this thread group and this recording controller. This is where I want to put the requests it captures. So I'm going to select the target controller and I'm going to test plan, thread group, recording controller. That means that when we start capturing, it will put requests in this controller. This controller is a simple controller. Basically, JMeter has different types of controllers that allows us to perform different operations and decide on logic and other aspects what samplers should be run inside the controller. So a simple controller like this, it will basically only execute all samplers that are inside it. I might need to explain that later, but for now, I'm just gonna select this recording controller as the target controller. I'm also gonna change the naming scheme to prefix so that we have a better understanding of what the requests are and what they do. And now that we have these three settings changed, that would be the port, the target controller, and the naming scheme. We need to make sure that JMeter will capture the packets that we send from the application, the sales application. To do that, I'm gonna set JMeter to be the proxy temporarily of the system. I'm gonna open the system settings for that. I'm gonna search here proxy and click on the first suggestion that shows up. I'm gonna, right here, down on the manual proxy setup, I'm gonna enable the use of proxy. And here on this field, we need to set up the address of the machine where JMeter is running. In this case, since JMeter is running on the same machine I'm doing these tests, I'm gonna set this to localhost, and this port field right here needs to be the same port you set on JMeter on the port setting. So right here, I'm gonna set it to 48 as well. And one thing I should mention before I click save is that once you click save, you might lose internet access to the rest of your applications. And that is because generally all applications rely on a secure connection to the internet. And once we put a server on the middle, that is no longer a secure connection because the proxy might be snooping on the requests. So with that in mind, if you need to access the internet and you're performing tests, you might need to disable this temporarily so that your applications can connect to the internet normally. And with that out of the way, I'm going to click save. I'm going to minimize this window. And right here on JMeter, we can begin recording the testing scripts from the application. So first thing I want to do before I click start is close the sales demo, because when the PowerServer application opens, it sends a couple of requests to the web API that we want to capture for our testing purposes. So I closed it, and now I can click start. It will show us this information dialog telling us that JMeter has a temporary certificate that we can add to our system in order for the applications to trust JMeter as a proxy. But since we don't need to do that for now, and we only want to do some testing on our application that doesn't actually require a trusted connection, we're gonna ignore this dialog. You can read it if you want, but it's not necessary for this session. I'm gonna click OK. And once this dialog shows up, it means that JMeter is now recording the whatever comes through its port, a 48 in this case. Now that it's recording, I'm gonna go to the Power Builder project. I'm gonna run the PowerServer application. It's gonna show us this warning again because we're still running on test mode. And once the application opens, I'm gonna go to the customer window. I'm gonna click on a couple of entries just to make the application send a couple of requests to the web API and that JMeter captures them. Once I click on a couple of more entries, I'm gonna close this window and then stop recording. It's very important that you do it in the order I did it. First, close the application and then stop the recording, because when you close a PowerServer application, it sends a couple of requests to the web API to destroy the session and make sure that the transaction is committed and also clean up the transaction. So since we also want to record those steps for our simulation, we want to first close the application and then stop recording. Since we finished recording, I'm gonna go back to the system settings and I'm gonna disable the proxy so that any connections that were failing so far are now restored. I'm gonna close the settings application since I'm not gonna use it for the moment. And if we see right here under the recording controller, we can see that there's a new controller that was created by JMeter when it recorded the requests. It has no name, so the first thing I'm gonna do is move this up a level. I'm gonna delete the controller we just emptied, and I'm gonna rename this controller to something more meaningful. So since we're gonna be using it for reading operations, I am gonna rename it reading controller. If we go to the view results tree of the test script recorder, we can see that it shows us the requests that were captured. It puts a green tick mark on the requests that were captured and were successful. So it puts them right here. And any requests that failed, for example, if you have any web browser open or any application that tried to access the internet when the proxy was enabled and failed because the proxy is not trusted, they will also show here. So in this case, there wasn't a lot of failed requests. It will depend on the situation, and you might have a lot more of failed requests. But the important thing is that the requests related to the PowerServer application show up here with a green tick mark. So next, I'm gonna go and right here, you can see there are many requests that were recorded. Each one of these is called a sampler. It basically performs an HTTP request and allows us to do something with the result. And each one of these samplers will be executed from top to bottom. So if we were to run this test right now, it will go to the thread group. And since this is the only one that exists right now, it's gonna start from the top, executing down until the last sampler of the thread group. And once it reaches the last sampler, it's gonna check if the loop count has been satisfied yet. And if not, it's gonna keep looping over the thread group. So in this case, there's a couple of requests that are of no use to us, like these three. We can get rid of them. They will not impact our testing. So there's also a couple of things we wanna do here. These two requests should only be run once, because we only need to create one session. The same applies for these three requests right here. We only need to delete the session and disconnect the application once. And that would be when we finished the test. So in this case, if we wanted to create one user and execute this test multiple times, it would create a problem because it would create the session every loop. So that would be resulting on multiple users in theory. So what we need to do in order to replicate a single user performing an operation multiple times is right click on the test plan, and we're gonna add a setup thread group. This thread group is special in that it only executes once and before all other thread groups. So in this case, it will execute before this thread group that contains our rating controller. So I wanna go and move these two requests into the setup thread group. And the same way a setup thread group exists, there's also a teardown thread group that has a similar behavior, but it's only executed after all the other thread groups have been executed, and it's only run once. So we want to do the same, and we're gonna put this request on the teardown thread group. That means that if we wanted, we could make this group of requests all the retrieve with parm. We could repeat them, for example, 100 times, and they would be executed 100 times, and after the 100th time, then the commit and create transaction and the disconnect and the destroy session would be executed. But this guarantees us that the session will only be created once on the setup thread group, and the session will be destroyed only once on the teardown thread group. Next, I'm gonna go to the thread group, and I'm gonna configure the thread properties on this panel right here. I'm gonna set the number of threads to be 10, the ramp-up period to be 1, and the loop count to be 1. This is only temporarily because since we wanna be testing that what we're doing to this test plan works, and we don't want those tests to take too long, we're gonna set them to a low value. So now that that's done, I'm gonna go to the view results tree of the HTTP test script recorder, and I'm gonna show you that you can see right here the requests that were captured. We can see the request, we can see the response. there's a couple of things that we need to parameterize. So that means basically that we need to change this test from using static values and using variables, so to make sure that these tests can be run multiple times. That is because every request that is performed relies on a session ID. And also sometimes if the operation is working on data, it also relies on a transaction ID value. And since these values are unique and they have a expiration period, we need to make sure that when these requests are run, we are always using a valid session and a transaction ID. For this example, we can see right here that the create session request returns us a session ID that will be unique for every time this create session request is run. So we need a way to capture this session ID value and use it in every other request that depends on that value. So for example, right here, we need to use the session ID from the create session request into the connect and create transaction. And also in every other retrieve with param request, we also need to pass here the session ID. The same applies for the transaction ID that is returned by the connect and create transaction request. Here it is. We will need to take this value, store it someplace, and then pass it to any request that depends on that value. I think it's not here, it's on request. So right here we can see that we need to replace the session. Also we need to replace the transaction. So we're gonna need to take the result from the connect and create transaction, this result, the transaction ID, and pass it to the requests. Right here, session is encrypted, but we can now pass it an unencrypted value since we enabled run mode. If we didn't enable run mode and set it to 1, any request that did not have a properly encrypted value would fail. Now that I know what values I need to extract and introduce in the rest of the requests, I am gonna go to the first of them, which is the session ID that we need. I'm gonna go to that. And the difference between preprocessor and postprocessor, by the way, is that preprocessors are executed before the request is performed. So in case you want to change some settings or modify some variables before the request is done, you would add a preprocessor. But since we want to work with the result of the request, we're going to go to postprocessors and then add a regular expression extractor. What this will do is take the response from the request and create a variable based on a regular expression match. So in this case, since I want to extract a variable for the session ID, I'm going to create a variable named session right here. And the regular expression will be, if you're not familiar with regular expressions, don't worry, I'm going to put the regular expression on the screen. But if we go to the create session request response, and we will see the pattern of text we need to match. So this word is session ID. This will be session ID, and then in between parentheses, there's going to be some characters. And that's our regular expression. We're going to use the first capture group. So that means the first group of parentheses that are matched. That's the first capture group. And we're going to use only the first match for the variable. What this will do is parse the response and then match this text and put the text that matches into the variable called session. So one thing to note about variables is that variables are only visible to the threads. So in this case, since we would be running this setup thread group on one thread, and it will create the session variable for that thread, it won't be available for the rest of the requests on other thread groups. So because that's a limitation of variables, we need to not use variables for this example. We're going to use properties, which are global to JMeter and available in all threads. So we're going to go to the setup thread group. I'm going to add a sampler, a bin shell sampler. This sampler allows us to execute some Java commands right here with some special syntax added to use functions and etc. So first thing, I'm gonna name this bin shell sampler to session BS because it's gonna capture the variable for session. And to define a property, we do this expression. We're gonna set the property named session to the value of the variable called session. And we close the parentheses of the function and then the curly braces for the expression. It doesn't matter if these names are the same because these are not on the same scope. Properties are independent of variables, so there's no problem if they have the same name. And then since we did this for the session ID value, we're gonna do the same for the transaction ID value. I'm gonna go to the create transaction, connect and create transaction request. I'm gonna go to add post processors and then add a regular expression extractor. The settings for this are gonna be a little bit different. I'm gonna set the name of the variable to transaction. The regular expression is gonna be similar but not the same, so I'm gonna copy it anyway. I'm gonna paste it and then I'm gonna change session ID to transaction ID. The template is going to be the same. It's going to be the first capture group and the first match. And with this done, I'm also going to create another bin shell sampler, but I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to paste it under the setup thread group, and I'm going to change its name to transaction BS. And instead of creating a property called the session, I'm going to create a property called transaction. And it's going to be filled with the value of the variable transaction. And with these properties now available, we're gonna go and replace any reference to those values across all the requests to the properties we created on the respective bin shells. So I'm gonna do an example on a couple of requests and then I'm gonna skip over the rest of them because there's a lot of them. So to begin, I'm gonna check this connect and create transaction. I'm gonna delete the value of the session attribute and I'm gonna create an interpolation here. I'm gonna add property and it's gonna ask for the property called session. And that should be enough. Next, I am gonna give another example with the first retrieve with param. I'm gonna change this session to be, actually I'm gonna copy the one I used here just to make sure that I don't make any spelling mistakes. I'm gonna insert it here and I am also gonna replace this transaction ID, but this time with the property transaction. And you need to go through each one of these and replace all instances of session and transaction ID. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. There we go. I finished replacing all instances of transaction ID and session ID from all requests. And I wanna make sure that I did this correctly by going into the this view results tree and run the test, just to make sure that I didn't mess anything up. It might throw you this warning. This file named recording.xml is a file set on the view results tree of the test script recorder right here. So it's basically recording all requests that are captured right here and putting them under this file. You can disable this by removing the file name, or you can just leave it like it is. I'm gonna leave it like it is. I'm gonna go to the view results tree. This view results tree is one kind of listener you can add to a test plan. It's right here under listener. So basically these listeners allow you to visualize the tests, the results on different ways, or you can do different things with each test that is executed. So that's basically why it's called a listener, because it listens for each sample that is executed. In this case, we're gonna go to the view results tree and I'm gonna click on the run. And I'm gonna just overwrite this existing file, and we should see that the tests run normally. There should not be any errors. Sometimes it might show you that it was executed correctly, but the response data is gonna tell us another story. So I'm gonna go into the response data of some of them, and there's no apparent errors, so that means we actually replaced everything correctly. Now let's say that, for example, you wanted to use a file to inside your tests. So for example, in this case, we can assume that we have a file with IDs of customers we want to query. So remember that we used to click on many customers to simulate a load. So if we go here, we can see that there's many requests that are using the IDs here. So basically we can, instead of using these numbers right here, we can insert the values from a file. And that's what we're gonna do right now. Say, for example, you have a CSV file with the IDs of the customers you wanna query. So we're gonna use this file called data.csv. And to introduce it into our testing plan, we go into config element inside the add menu, and we're gonna add a CSV data set config. I'm gonna select the file. I'm gonna leave the file encoding blank so that it's detected automatically. As for the variable names, I'm gonna use these two. So the way you do that is you take the column names and you map them to variables that you can name whatever you want. So in this case, I'm gonna name them entry and ID. The variable names, wrong field. And I'm gonna set true to ignore first line because this is where we have our column names for the CSV. And sharing mode, all threads to be the same to the current thread, so that each thread will take a different value. If we set it to all threads would take the first value on the first loop and the second value on the second loop, and so on and so forth. If we do current thread, it will take the first value for the first thread, the second value for the first thread, and so on and so forth. So now that we have our IDs being injected through the ID variable, we can go and go into the request that we want to replace it into. So that would be this one. And I am gonna use the variable named ID. I'm gonna copy this. And since this is another request that is looking for another different data window, I'm gonna copy this here as well. The same applies in here. And I think this is where it starts repeating. So instead of replacing it here as well, I'm just gonna delete these samplers. I think I missed one. And also I'm gonna delete these ones as well. So instead of repeating the same requests over and over, we're using a CSV file to pass the IDs that we want to query. So with that done, now we're gonna go and simulate the test we defined in our first testing goal, which is simulating one user performing 200 operations. So I'm gonna go to the thread group. I'm gonna configure this to be 200 threads. That would be 200 threads running this series of operations simultaneously. I'm gonna change the ramp up period to 10 and the loop count to 1. So that way we can visualize the results of this simple test in which we perform some reading operations and we introduce values from a CSV file into the samplers. So I'm going to go into the graph results. I'm going to clear this view. I'm going to clear all views. I'm going to stay here on the view results in table listener, and I'm going to click start the test. I'm going to replace the file, and I'm going to wait for a bit for this test to complete all the 200 threads. You can see right here on the top right corner that the number of threads that are running right now is being listed. So I'm going to wait for a bit for this to conclude. Finally, the test concluded, so we can go into the different listeners we have here and visualize the results from our tests. In this case, both the view results in table and the graph results show us the timings of the requests. So that would be how long it took for the request to be completed across all the requests and on what sample it took that time. So we can use this to benchmark the performance of our server in handling the loads we defined here on our thread group. And the same here is in the graph results table, but graphically. So let's say that you have your own example and you run into some requests that have something like ESQL select or ESQL update or ESQL delete, for example, and you're wondering what those are. Well, if your application is using embedded SQL on the PowerScript code, when you convert that project to PowerServer, it takes that SQL statement and moves it into the web APIs, and then it gives it a name, and the name is used inside your application. When it's querying the web APIs, it provides the name that was generated, and then the external SQL statement is executed on the server, and then the response is sent back to the application. So for example, in this case, if we go to the web APIs folder, and then there's going to be a project called app models. I'm going to open that. There's going to be a folder with the application name, and then a folder with the ESQL statements grouped into classes depending on the operation they performed. So for example, I'm going to go and open the select class, and you can see that all the embedded SQL statements were grouped into here, and they were given a specific name. So let's say that you wanted, for example, to swap out this value for different users. So for example, one user would run a specific ESQL statement and another user would run another different SQL statement. So if you wanted to do that, you could go to add preprocessors and then add a user parameters preprocessor, and this will apply to all samplers that are below this controller. If you place it under the thread group here, it's going to apply to all the controllers and all samplers that are contained inside this thread group. So for now, I'm going to move it into the controller. And in here, we can create variables that will be different for each user if you set it so. So for example, if we add 2 users and we have variables named SQL handle and the value, for the first thread, it would give this variable the value specified in here. And for the second thread, it would give it a variable with the value of whatever you put in here. So if you had more than 2 variables, it would start looping around. So for the third thread, you would get the variable with the first value set, and so on and so forth. So right now, let's say, for example, you wanted the first user to run this statement, and the second user to run this statement. And then let's say that let's give the same value to both of them. And since this preprocessor will be creating variables, now we need to introduce those variables into the samplers that are going to use them. So here I'm going to change the ESQL value with, I can see, there you go, with ESQL handle. And then the value, I will replace it with the value that is gonna be in the variable named value. So now that we have done this, I'm gonna check that we actually use the names correctly. SQL handle. It's actually SQL handle. So now that we have the names of the variables checked, I'm gonna go to the view results tree. And before running it, I'm gonna go to the thread group first and make sure that we're actually using more than one user. So I'm gonna set it to 3. And then back in the view results tree, now I am gonna run the test. And this should be pretty quick because it's a simple test. Now if we go into the requests here, we can see that 3 threads were started and each thread was passed a value corresponding to the user parameters preprocessor. So for example, the first thread was passed the first value, the second thread was passed the second value, and the third thread was passed the same value as the first thread because it wrapped around. So basically this is how you can use the SQL handle on the samplers. You need to obtain them from the Web APIs project, or actually the App Models project, and then you can use them into the samplers and replace them with user parameters. We are now going to move on onto our next case, in which we're going to be simulating some more complex CRUD operations. For this case, we're going to be using some resources we created during the simple read operations case. So please make sure that you have that one available while working on this. Here in JMeter, first thing I'm going to do is save a copy of this file so that we have a backup of the previous test case we did. I'm going to save this as a copy. Like I did right here, you can see that the file name is different now. And now that we have a copy saved on the disk now, I'm going to disable the reading controller that we were using for our read operations simulation. I'm going to right click on the thread group. I'm going to add a logic controller. It will be a simple controller, and I'm going to name it a CRUD controller. And I'm going to click away from this to have the name update. So like I did last time, I need to go to the test script recorder. I need to configure the same settings I did last time that were the port, the target controller, and the prefix. These both the port and the naming scheme are already set from the previous example, so the only thing we need to change now is the target controller. For this, I'm going to select the CRUD controller we just created. I am going to go to my system settings and I'm going to search for proxy. I'm going to re-enable it again so that it points to JMeter. Click save. And now that the proxy is enabled, I'm going to start JMeter's proxy. I'm going to go back to the PowerServer application. I'm going to run it. And this time I'm going to simulate another different behavior. I'm going to click here on add. I'm going to add a new entry. I'm going to fill it with my names. With this, I'm going to create a new entry. Once the fields are filled, I'm going to click save. It's going to save. Now that the entries are saved, I'm going to modify them. I'm going to click save again. And now I'm going to delete them. Once again, first I'm going to close the window and then I'm going to click stop. And here on JMeter, we can see under CRUD controller, we have the operations we wanted to capture. And since we already did the reading operations, I'm going to delete all the retrieves and I'm going to only leave the operations related with the creation and update and deletion of the entry we try to operate on. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this as well. These three don't matter, so I'm going to delete them. This one as well. So that should leave us with the create This is where we update and delete. And yeah, so since we already have these requests on the teardown and the setup thread groups, I'm gonna delete them for now, but we're gonna be using them again. So I'm gonna delete this too, and I'm gonna move these samplers into the CRUD controller so that the empty controllers that were created are empty, and I'm gonna delete them. And now that everything's recorded, I'm gonna go back to my proxy settings and I'm gonna disable the proxy. Just click on the switch and close the window, that's enough. Next, I am gonna inspect the requests that were captured so that we can know what things we need to parameterize this time, starting from the create session, which is the last when we open the application. So the retrieve with params are gonna be ignoring them. I'm gonna go into the insert with param and see what it's returning us. There's nothing here we can use, so in here it appears it's returning us the ID of the thing we just created. So this value, I'm gonna be probably storing this value and inserting it in the request down the line. So if we go into the data store update, we can see that this is where the entry we created is saved. So it's using the ID we just saw in the select with param request. So we're gonna need to insert this ID in this request, and we're also gonna need to insert the name of the entry we are trying to simulate in here as well. And in this request, it's using the ID as well, so we need to insert it here as well. And we can leave the rest of it as it is. So we're gonna ignore the retrieves. This is where it creates the transaction. Data store update. Here's the ID again, so we're gonna insert it here too. And I believe this is where the data is updated, so we're gonna insert some new data here as well. We're gonna be generating some data randomly so that we can insert it, and it's a different entry every time. The retrieve with params are gonna ignore it. Delete with param. Here we use the ID again, and here too, and here too. So okay, that's what we need to do. First things first, since we're simulating first a single user doing all these requests, we need to reuse the session ID and transaction ID we created on the previous example. So I'm gonna go into each request and I'm gonna replace the session ID values and transaction ID values for the properties we have defined. I finished replacing all the transaction ID values with the property transaction and the session values with the session property. And but since you can see right here, actually in the view results tree, there's a couple of requests called commit and create transaction. These requests specifically, what they do is they commit a transaction containing the operations previous to it, and then return to us a different transaction ID. So what we need to do with these operations is capture the transaction ID again and store it in the property after they're executed. So to do that, I'm gonna reuse what we already have on the connect and create transaction request. I'm gonna paste it. I'm gonna copy it and paste it inside the commit and create transaction, all of them. So yep, Control-C, Control-V works just fine here. And also to set the property to assign the property the value of the variable created here, I am gonna copy the transaction bean sampler. I'm gonna paste it on the thread group and move it below each commit and create transaction operation. This here and this one right there. So now if we go into the thread group just to test that everything we did is fine, I'm gonna set this to 1, set this to 1, I'm gonna clear the view results tree. And I'm gonna click this button here to start the test. And we can see that there's something wrong here. So the response is telling us that there's a syntax error inside the request. So I'm gonna go and check. And we can see here that the transaction ID is empty. So something went wrong there. I'm gonna go and check here the previous requests. Oh, we can see right here. There's any invalid character inside this request. The commit and create transaction after the delete. So here we can check that I actually forgot to replace that character. So if I do that, I save and I go to the view results tree again and click run one more time. This time everything runs correctly. I'm just gonna verify the responses of all the requests. And yeah, it seems everything is done correctly, except this, because we still haven't replaced the IDs we were talking about. But the rest, the session ID and the transaction ID, is already working fine. So to do the next part, we need to see what request was the one with that returned us the ID. It's this one, the select with parm. So I'm gonna go into this one. I'm gonna add a bus processor, a regular expression extractor, and the name of the created variable will be entity ID. The regular expression will extract it from here. I'm gonna grab this string and paste it in here. Now, since parentheses are a special character inside the regular expressions, I'm gonna insert a backward slash so that they're escaped and treated as a regular character for both opening and closing, and also periods are also special characters. So right here I'm gonna capture some digits that are gonna be more than one, and that is gonna be the number we're gonna capture into our variable. So the template is gonna be the first capture group. So that means this piece right here is what is gonna be put into the variable, and the first match. So with that done, since we're only gonna use this variable inside this thread group, there's no need to create a property for that. So I'm gonna be using the variable directly. So I'm gonna insert this variable here, entity ID, and I'm gonna copy it and paste it in all the requests where I see this number, because that's the ID that's created on the insert with parm. So I'm gonna go ahead and look for the rest of them. And it should be this one. And I think that's all the places where the number shows up. So once again, to test that everything is working correctly, I'm gonna clear the view results tree and I'm gonna start the test one more time. Everything is running fine. If we go to the request view and go into the request we modified, we can see that the number is being captured from the select with parm request. We can see right here that the number was 22,102, and right here on the request is 22,102. So we just parameterize the entity ID of the data we're creating. Next, I want to make sure that these names are generated randomly. So I'm gonna add a config element random variable entry. I am gonna name it first name generator. The variable name is gonna be first name, and the output format, here we introduce the format in which we want to the random values to be. So I'm gonna make it first name underscore and a sequence of numbers that will be replaced by the random number we choose here. So I'm gonna set it to 5 digits, so this is gonna be 5 digits as well. And since we have this, I am gonna take this and paste it again, so we duplicate it, and this is gonna be our last name generator. I'm gonna change this format to last name, and the seed has to be different for each different generator so that they don't generate the same value when they're performing their operations. So I'm gonna use a different seed for each one. And since we're also editing the entry we are creating, and in the simulation we did a single character replacement on the last name, I'm gonna create another generator for this. I'm gonna right click it, and here the duplicate action will create a duplicate, and this is gonna be the new last name. And once again, I'm gonna change the output format. I'm gonna just input that, and I have to change the seed for this too, so that the values don't coincide. With this done, I'm gonna go to the requests where the names are used. Since they're variables, I only need to use the variables and insert them right here. So this is the first name. I'm gonna change this here as well. And I think the only other place where the names are involved is in the other data store update instructions. So right here, I'm gonna set it again to be first name. And you can see here, this is the new value I updated, and this is the previous value. So this is gonna be last name. And this right here is gonna be new last name. I'm just gonna go to the generators to make sure that the variable names are correct. I actually forgot to change the variable names, so this is last name, and this is first new last name. With that done, I'm gonna save this test plan. You can use the menu here, or you can just use Ctrl+S to save. So now that we changed those values, I'm gonna go back into the view results tree, clear it, and run the test again. And everything still appears to be fine. Yeah, everything seems correct so far. So before we do that, before we keep going, there were some other entries that we needed to modify and parameterize here. This, for example, it contains the date and the time of the moment in which this data was modified. So in order to do that in the simulation as well, what we are going to do is use one of JMeter's functions that allows us to insert the time. I'm going to first keep it right here so that we can see what format the time has. I'm going to use the function called time. And here we have to specify a format string, and we're going to use the day right here to determine the format we need to use for the format string. So this is, you can check the syntax of the format string in the documentation on JMeter. I'm going to link to it on the video. But for now, this is dd, and then it's a space, hour, minute, second, period, and second, milliseconds, I mean. I'm going to use this, and then I'm going to delete the string since we no longer have a use for it. And this function will insert the current time when this request is executed. So there was another, I think I saw another date similar to this. Yeah, right here. I'm going to replace this as well. And just to make sure that there's not other samplers that require the current date. No, there's not. All right. And one more time to test that the replacement was successful, I am gonna run the test plan, And I'm gonna go into the request we modified and check that in fact the date has been generated automatically. And we could go from here and run the test with the full parameters, but since I wanna first make sure that we do we change this from single user to multi-user, I'm gonna refrain from doing that right now. So if you've noticed, since we're creating the session on the setup thread group and destroying it on the teardown thread group, we're basically simulating one single user performing these operations as many times as you have configured on the thread group. But since we now want to simulate multiple users performing these operations this number of times, what we need to do is move this create session and everything in here into the main thread group, and also the whatever is on the teardown thread group, I'm going to move it into the end of the CRUD controller. And since we're working on a thread per thread basis now, we cannot use properties anymore. So I'm going to remove these bin shells that set the properties. I'm going to remove them all. And on the samplers, I'm actually gonna move this to the top for clarity. And with that done, now in the other samplers, instead of using the properties here, I am gonna be using the variables directly. So this would be session, this would be transaction, and I'm gonna do the same thing for the rest of them. What could make the job easier is maybe go to search, and we're gonna look for this string, and we're gonna replace it with session. If we click here on replace all, it's gonna show us which samplers it replaced the string, and we can go and check that everything is correct for the session at least, and it appears it is. So now I'm gonna repeat this step, but instead of using the session, I'm gonna use the transaction. I'm gonna click again on replace all, and now I'm gonna again go through them and make sure that the value was replaced correctly, and it appears so. So to make sure, first I'm gonna reset the search so that the highlighting boxes disappear, and I'm gonna run this test once to make sure that the replacing was done correctly. I am gonna go to the view results entry, clear it, and click the start button. And if we check in here, we can see that everything was replaced correctly. So now that we know that our parameterization was done correctly, we can start going into the thread group and start escalating the value little by little, the number of threads, so that we can see if there's any problems that arise from us having multiple users running the same operations at the same time. So I'm going to start with a low value of 5, and I'm going to go into the view results tree and clear it. And we're going to try to see if there's any errors that might come up. There's no apparent errors, but if we, just to make sure, I'm going to go through the responses of the requests to see if there's anything that could have gone wrong here. Everything seems in order, so I'm gonna raise the value a little bit more. I'm gonna set it to 10. I'm gonna return to the view results tree. I'm gonna clear it again and click the run button. And now we can see that there's some problems starting to arise here. I am going to click on it and see what the error might be. It's telling us that there's an unexpected character. So that probably means that there's a variable that wasn't replaced. Here it is. It's this variable. If we remember, the place where we set this variable is on the select with parm request. So I'm going to go into it and see what the problem might be. And right here, it's telling us something, that there's an error on the database. A deadlock occurred on the operation we were trying to perform. So this is an error that happens with the sales demo application in the current version as of now. This error is caused by trying to access the database in a concurrent manner when the code is not properly handling concurrent access. So if you were to run into this error in your own application, you would have to find the location where the situation is happening and analyze it and design it to allow concurrent access without compromising the data. So in order to fix this error, you would have to go to the Power Builder application and modify the code, specifically modify the embedded SQL code that has this statement. And you will have to make sure that it's synchronized correctly. Now, if you do that on the Power Builder project and then redeploy, the ESQL handles of the request will change. So if you deploy that, it will result on our tests breaking right here because we're using SQL handles, and rebuilding that project will result on different SQL handles. So for now, instead of going to the Power Builder project and modifying the code, I am gonna go to the web APIs where the ESQL statements are placed into classes, and instead of modifying the code directly inside Power Builder, I'm gonna modify the statements in here. And for this specific error in this specific application, the error is solved by doing a with no lock on this specific statement. Now, if you can see, it's the same statement that is being used for the request that threw us the error. Now it was right here, select with parm request. It's the 7A 7C handle, it's this one. So we locate this statement and add the no lock parameter to the statement. And once we do that, I'm gonna close the web APIs and I'm gonna run them again so that the new statement is loaded. I repeat, this solution is specific to this project and we arrived to it after locating and analyzing the problem. So if you're working on your own project, you will too have to do your own analysis and implement the solution on your own. And once it runs, I am gonna go back to JMeter, I'm gonna clear the view results tree and I'm gonna run the tests again. Now this is a different type of error, so I'm gonna wait for it to finish to see what the errors might be. And now that they're finished, I'm gonna go to the first one. And right here, right off the bat, we can see that the session and probably the transaction as well haven't been replaced. So now, since this is a data store update, I'm gonna go to the place where the transaction is being set. And invalid session it's telling us. So since the only place where sessions are created are in the create session request, I'm gonna go to them, and right here it's telling us that the number of active sessions has reached the maximum limit allowed by the license. So this is something you have to keep in mind when you're doing testing with multiple users, because depending on the license you have, it determines what the maximum amount of active sessions you can have at any specific time. And right now, since I'm running a developer license, it has a limit of 5 simultaneous sessions. So in order to fix that, I'm gonna swap this license for a production license for this demonstration. And I'll do that. We'll continue with our example. I replaced the license, so I'm gonna rebuild the PowerServer application. I'm gonna wait for it to finish deploying. And now that it finished deploying, I'm gonna go to the web APIs console window. I'm gonna close it because we want to reload the license. I'm gonna run it again. And once it finishes launching, I'm gonna go back to JMeter, right click, clear, and run once again. There's no errors about session anymore, so that's a good sign, but we're still gonna wait and see if there's, and there they are. I'm gonna wait. There, it's finished, so I'm gonna go back to the first instance of the error. Same thing, something was not replaced, entity ID, so select with parm, fail to roll back because there's no available database connection or transaction. So the request in charge of creating the transaction is the commit and create transaction request. So I'm gonna go and look at them to see if there's anyone that's giving us something that it shouldn't. And so far nothing. That's odd. Did I miss one? Oh, right here on the insert with parm request is telling us that the limit for the database server connections has been exceeded. So that's another thing. The SQL Anywhere personal database has a limit of 10 simultaneous connections. So we might have gone over that with the number we inserted here. So I'm gonna lower this number to 5 for now to see if that solves the issue. And I'm gonna clear the view and I'm gonna run it again. And the test finished, so there doesn't appear to be any errors this time, but I'm still gonna go through all of them to verify. And it appears that everything is alright. So yeah, when you're running tests, you need to be really aware of the number of the different limitations you have around the number of users you can run. So for example, the license for the PowerServer determines how many users you can have at the same time, as well as the database manager you're using for the connections. It might also have a limit of concurrent connections. So you might want to use a database system that allows you to configure the number of connections you might have at the same time. Now, for example, let's say that there's a request that you want to be executed only when there's a certain number of users ready to execute it, and you want it to be executed at the same time. There's a certain tool in JMeter that allows you to do exactly that. They're called the timers. They allow you to change the timing at which the request is being executed on each thread. So in this case, what we want to do is called a synchronizing timer. What this is gonna do is we're gonna configure the number of users we want it to group, and so when it reaches this sampler, JMeter is gonna wait for it to be 5 threads ready to execute this sampler. So only after 5 threads have gathered, it's gonna execute them all at the same time. And to visualize the effects of the synchronizing timer, I'm gonna run this test inside the view results in table view, because it allows us to see the start time of the requests. So I'm gonna clear this view first, and I'm gonna run it again. I'm gonna wait for it to complete. And now that it's completed, we're gonna look for this specific request. Is the commit and create transaction 134. I'm gonna go here, I'm gonna expand the label for the samplers. And right here, we can see it's this, and this. Yeah, those are the requests that were synchronized. Now you can see here that these 3 started roughly actually at the same time, and the following ones took a little bit more time. but that is because of the CPU. It has to schedule all the other threads that are being executed, but the functionality is still there. So the flow of execution of these samplers stops right here until 5 threads have gathered, and once the 5 threads, or the number you configure on this field, is fulfilled, then it starts executing the rest of the samplers, including this one. So that's why there might be a couple that are synchronized in time, but because it also wants to execute the next ones, it's gonna start scheduling the other request to another time in order to fulfill the other ones first. So yeah, that's how you can use a synchronizing timer to make sure that there's some samplers that are executed by a specific number of users at the same time. Or when you want the flow of execution for your specific test to wait on a specific sampler for a certain number of users, for example. And finally, let's say that we are finished with our tests. We need to be really careful with the next step, because for a reason of security, we need to do this. So remember first, when we change the run mode of the web APIs to be test mode, we need to revert this once the testing is done, because we don't want the session ID to be exposed to other people on the listening on the same network. So I'm going to change this to 0. I'm going to close the web APIs, and I'm going to run them again. Now, if we launch the PowerServer application, it will not tell us that the application is running on test mode. This is a very important step that you need to make when you finish with your testing. That's it from me for this presentation. Don't forget to keep in touch with the Appian community and the Appian accounts on the links you see on your screen. Thank you for watching.